Introduce today's speaker, Jay Gann, the Department of Environmental Science. Jay and his lab have been working with a couple of districts as part of the PACVEC. Jay is one of the PIs at UC Riverside. So he's been working with Saciolo and West Valley, for example. And today he's going to talk about urban insecticide use and environmental effects. So I shall turn it over to you.
Well, okay, I guess I don't have to speak to the speaker, right?
No, they can hear you.
Okay. Hi, Chris. Hi, everybody at UC Davis and elsewhere, and also hi to people here in the room that I can see. Well, first of all, we're very happy to be part of this great program. We're in second year. We're looking forward for more collaboration down the road. What we do is a little bit different. I'm an environmental chemist, but I have really done a lot of work, spent most of my years working on pesticides. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit different, but I hope still at the end of the talk, there's some information that can be useful for some of us here going forward. So the title of my talk is Urban Insecticide Use and Environmental Effect. But I'm going to focus on the negative effects on aquatic ecosystem mostly. And also the talk is going to be focused on California. And before I start, these are, I have a lot of co-authors here, except a couple of people, most of them were my former PhD students. You can see that we graduated quite a few students by working on pesticides. And also I have to say that at least two of them are now working for the California pesticide regulation. So they are regulators now. Here's an outline of my talk. First of all, I'm going to give a little bit background on urban use pesticides in California, especially insecticide use around homes. And then I'm going to move on and talk about some of the work we have done to show you, to demonstrate to you that urban use of pesticides around homes can cause surface water contamination through so-called surface runoff. And I'll give you some examples, some information. In the end, I will try to make a connection to the project we have, and hopefully there we have some sparks, and so we can potentially do some collaboration down the road. Okay, in terms of pesticides and environmental issues or pesticides and water quality issues in California, I think it's fair to say that in the 1980s, we had a lot of issues with herbicides use, especially in the Bay Delta area, because that's where we produce a lot of rice. But of course, when you produce rice, you use a lot of herbicides. And when you release the water, you have a lot of issues. So back in the 80s, in California, the focus was really on herbicides and rice production. In the 1990s, we have quite a bit of issues with OPs, organophosphate insecticides. Some of that is due to human health issues, and some of that is due to aquatic toxicity issues, like good examples, for example, diazinon and Pyrethroid. Those are insecticides. They were used both in urban areas as well as in agricultural production. But as we know that both diazinon and Pyrethroid were banned for urban use and also for a lot of other uses, probably in the 1990s. Since the beginning of 2000, I think the tide has shifted, and the environmental issues in California with related to pesticide use really has had a focus on pyrethroids. And that's where we came in. I think my work, my research also on this topic started about the same time on pyrethroids at the beginning of 2001, around that time. So this is still ongoing, and California Department of Pesticide Regulation and some other agencies like the Water Board, they are still extremely concerned with pyrethroid use in the state. We still have a lot of issues. We have made a lot of progress. So this is the theme I'm going to talk about today. Well, first of all, insecticide use around homes. I know that most of us are working on vector control. People in the audience were thinking about use of pesticides or growth regulating hormones for mosquito control or some other vector control. But as we know that the major use of pesticides really is agricultural production. But like places like California, of course, we use a lot of pesticides in urban areas because up and down the coast, we have a lot of urban regions. And especially insecticide use has caused a lot of issues. So in terms of insecticide use around homes, as we know, we have a lot of very populated areas, and given that California is a very nice place to live, we have good temperature and dry. So that means pests like ants, cockroaches, they can survive the winter very comfortably. And so we always have a lot of this pest pressure. So to deal with that, a lot of homes we have to use insecticides to control these so-called structural pests. And there are two types of uses if you think about it. One is to use of these chemicals around the house or outside the house. That's for probably the most used urban use. That's called structural pest control or landscape pest control. And normally, a lot of homeowners use professional applicators to do the work. So you pay them monthly, and they come to your house once or twice a month, and you hope them to come to your house more often because you pay the money. And so you don't want to see any ants or any spiders. So on the other hand, as we also know that we also, as homeowners, we go to Home Depot, right? And we buy a lot of these products. Basically, if you go to Home Depot, look to the gardening section, most of the products you buy, they all contain pyrethroids. And the other type of use is indoor. Indoor use, as we know, for example, you can use chemicals on pets, but then when you wash your dog, your cats, especially dogs, the chemicals can go down into the drain to the wastewater treatment plants. And also if you use like foggers, use other chemicals, cockroaches, for example, if you mop the floor, and the water eventually goes into the wastewater, and that's another source for the chemicals to eventually come out into the environment. So there are two types of uses. So as we all know, most of the urban use pesticides nowadays are really pyrethroids. And there are some other exceptions, like fipronil, for example, and some other chemicals. And these are some of the most used chemicals, pesticides in California. And pyrethroids, as we know, we have a lot of experts in the audience. Of course, they are made of they're man-made mimics of pyrethrins. And pyrethrins are what we use in mosquito control as adulticides. Normally, when we use pyrethrins, we use also PBO as a synergizer to enhance that effectiveness. But the pyrethrins, as we know, they are natural. So there are two types, pyrethrin 1, pyrethrin 2, as you can see here. And pyrethrin, in terms of efficacy for controlling things like ants, maybe even mosquitoes, I would say probably they're less effective compared to pyrethroids. That's why I think after we discovered pyrethroids, men or humans, we went ahead, discovered a lot of new chemicals. They are basically pyrethroid mimics, and they're called pyrethroids. I don't know why we always call them synthetic pyrethroids, because all pyrethroids are synthetic. But there are two types of pyrethroids. One is type 1, the other is type 2, or maybe generation 1, generation 2. The only difference is the type 2 has a cyano group, as you can see here, that I had a star there. But most of these pyrethroids are highly potent, and all you need is just a few grams or few, very tiny little bit over a huge area. You can control all kinds of insects very well. Of course, we're not using most of these chemicals for mosquito controls, likely because my guess is they're too stable compared to pyrethroids. Pyrethroids can break down very quickly, even though they're maybe a little bit less effective. But environmentally speaking, probably they're more environmentally friendly compared to pyrethroids. Here is a chart I want to show you. It's a little bit hard to see on the y-axis. It's called log KOW. That's what we use to measure hydrophobicity. And it's a little hard to see, but pyrethroids is the third column. As you can see here, the log KOW, it's on a log scale. The log KOW is for pyrethroids, it's very, very high. It's almost as high as DDT or more. So what this really means is the pyrethroids, the synthetic pyrethroids, they are very hydrophobic. That means they will stick to a lot of surfaces or particles very strongly. So that has a very important implications in terms of their environmental distribution or movement. If you apply pyrethroids, say to a field, to soil, very likely the pyrethroids will stay with the particles for a long time, also will not easily move away. But when the particles move, of course, pyrethroids will move with particles. So that's one very important feature of pyrethroids, is they stick to organic matter, they stick to fine particles. The other very important property for pyrethroids, that's why I think we're having issues with pyrethroids from a water quality perspective, is they're potent for a lot of insects, but they're also very, very potent or toxic to a lot of aquatic invertebrates. When people study these kind of things, like aquatic toxicology, they use a little indicator species. It's a water flea. It's called Daphnia magma. There are a few different other types. You can see here the LC50 for pyrethroids on a log scale is very, very low. In many cases, lower than OPs. That means a little bit of these chemicals in aquatic systems, they can cause harms to aquatic invertebrates because they have very small biomass. So I guess same thing can be said for mosquitoes. If we use pyrethroids to kill mosquitoes, I'm sure they're very effective. Probably does not take very much. So those are the two things that are very important. One is they absorb to the environmental media very strongly, and also they are, from an aquatic or ecotoxicology perspective, they're highly aquatic. They're highly toxic at very, very low levels. Okay, now I'm going to switch gear a little bit, talk about how this pesticide use around homes, and also how they move into the natural environment, especially to surface water. If you look at a typical neighborhood in California, here's probably what you're going to see. You have a house, hopefully a big house. Then you have a front yard, then a swimming pool. But what you're seeing here really, if you look from, up down, you can see that urban, so-called urban area really has a very strong feature that is has a lot of impervious surface area. In other words, you have most of the space is taken up by surfaces that cannot penetrate water. Water will not infiltrate. So that's a very typical setup. And so if you use chemicals or if you use other things, you can imagine that they can easily move onto the street and along the street, along the gutter. Then they go into the catch basins in most cases during irrigation events or during rain events. Here's a typical street view. As you can see, water just drains into these so-called storm water catch basins. And here's another diagram to show the urban water cycle. Again, here I want to emphasize that for urban environments, it's very different from agricultural field because we have a lot of pavement. So the water, that's made, of course, to convey the water very effectively, so we do not have flooding, we do not have issues. But on the other hand, if you have chemicals or other things, this water can easily transport the contaminants into downstream. Here, in terms of pesticides, if we use pesticides, could be herbicides, could be insecticides. If we spray, for example, they can move in two ways. For some chemicals, if they have good water solubility, as we know, they can move in water. Okay, that's called dissolved runoff. In the other form, of course, is if they can absorb particles, then they can move with the particles. When the particles move, they move as well. This is especially true for pyrethroids, because as I just mentioned, pyrethroids have very strong absorption, very high affinity for particles. So when the runoff carries these particles down the drain, and they'll carry also pyrethroid residues with them. Okay, there are two forms of transport. Here again, in terms of pesticides, as we know, they come in different formulations. They come into different EC formulation. You can spray, or you can use granules. Okay. Also, we have the repellents. We have traps. So that means they can transport or move in different forms. For some of the granulars, for example, if you have irrigation turned on right after your application, they can just wash the granules directly into the drains. But for spray, of course, it'll be totally different. So here at the bottom, I have a number from, again, from CDPR. You can see here, even though we're using a lot of these different chemicals. There are many different types, but the major ones are the pyrethroids and fipronil and some other chemicals, but they come in many different commercial names, so many different products. Okay, so a little bit more on what we have done. So this is a typical home, as you can see here. It's a pretty nice home. After application, typically the pesticides is applied around the perimeter, around the homes, for example, for ant control. And sometimes people like to treat like right in front of the garage door because that's a good entry for ants and other things. So you can imagine that when you have a runoff, pesticides can move along the sidewalk, or they can also move down the driveway. And driveway probably is a very major component of this transport. So we have done a lot of work on this along with some other people like Mike Rust and his group, and also some other people from UC Berkeley and UC Davis. So once they move away in the runoff, they'll go into the drain. And we have a lot of storm drains, storm catch basins or drains. As we can see that almost every few hundred yards, or maybe not even that long, we have a storm catch basins. Some are bigger, some are smaller, as you can see here. But if you look carefully, below the cover, in the middle of the slide, you can see that there's a diagram. They come in, of course, in different configurations. But what you really have is the water that's going into the catch basins, and it all of a sudden become relatively stagnant. Basically, it's a trap. And so the water slows down, the particles will settle down. And if you have big debris, for example, it'll settle down. I think that, of course, is important to keep the flow smooth so the water can flow out. Eventually, after the water, like for example, from a neighborhood going into the drain, eventually the water is going to come out from somewhere. Most of us would not notice this, but if you look carefully in your community or in your neighborhood, there's always a place where the water comes out. That's called stormwater outfall. And that water just is discharged into the natural environment. In most cases, of course, it's just the water is not much in California, as we know, and it'll just flow out at a slow volume. But sometimes when you have a rainfall, of course, a rainstorm, a lot of things can get flushed out. In most cases, of course, this water will go into the natural open environment. That's the water that's feeding our natural, so-called natural streams or surface streams. This could also become, of course, important ecosystems, but also very important for mosquitoes, yes. So years ago, we had done some work, try to relate the loose dust particles on concrete with pesticide runoff. This work was done by one of my former PhD students. So basically, we did some simulated work. We set some concrete slabs outside. Then we basically did simulated runoff. And so what we did a lot of experiments here in Irvine, actually, at Orange, South Coast Station. What you see here is on the x-axis is the concentration of your chemicals that we measured on the concrete surfaces. We basically use a vacuum, but to vacuum up all the dust. Then on the y-axis is the runoff, the levels of chemicals or levels of pyrethroids in the runoff water that we connected. You can see there's a very good correlation, almost 1-to-1. If you look at the slope, the A, that's almost 1-to-1. In other words, the loose particles are really a major source for the chemical pesticide contamination in the runoff. So we have done this for pyrethroids and also for fipronil. That's a different major class of pesticides. Even you put all of them together, the slope is almost 1. That really tells us that in California, of course, we most time of the year it's dry. So the concrete pavement, like the driveways, surface streets, they're covered with dust. We normally don't think about this, but this dust contains a lot of contaminants, like pesticides, for example. So when you have a rainstorm, it'll wash these particles into the drain. So this is a major source of our contamination. So this is again, I think it was good for us to really pinpoint this. So later on, also we did a little bit more extensive survey, and this is a subdivision in Riverside. We picked 2 neighborhoods. One is old, basically relatively old neighborhood with old houses. A new, relatively new house neighborhood. And what we did is we went out, we took a lot of, used a swipe, like sponge kind of thing, to collect all the dust wash off all the dust from the surface. We found, as you can see here, everywhere we looked, this is Riverside, North Orange County, we were able to find all kinds of pyrethroids. The levels are pretty low, of course, but nanograms, this is based on nanogram per meter square. But the truth is, if you care to look for these chemicals, you can find them on all the streets everywhere in Riverside. And I'm almost sure that in Orange County, because people use more, just because they have more money, I guess. So very likely, if we do the same thing in Orange County or Yale County on the surface, on their surfaces, we'll probably have more. The dust would have more of these pyrethroids. We have done this for different months of the year and different areas, and we have done for different chemicals. And here also, just to show you on a microscopic, not really microscopic, if you look at a single house, the driveway, the gutter, the street, you can see that it's pretty even distribution almost. That's because the dust particles move around by wind, by water. So it's easy to understand. So the bottom line is also even along the gutter, you have relatively high concentrations on the street as well. So you can imagine that if we have a rain events or irrigation, it can just sweep these particles into the drain. And this is just for different month. Normally higher levels in the summer month, but relatively less in February. As you can see, the green bars, that's after a few rain events, of course, the levels decrease. Okay, here I want to quickly mention a project I was involved. That's almost like this current project. It's a great collaboration between UC Davis and UC Riverside and UC A&R. The PI was Lauren Oakey from the Urban Environmental Horticulture Department at UC Davis, and Darren Haber and myself. So this was a very impressive project. Was was supported by the State Water Resource Control Board. I think we got like $1.9 million for the whole thing. Continued for 3 or 4 years. What we did is we had 4 neighborhoods in Northern California and 4 neighborhoods in Southern California. We took samples on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. The place we took the sample were all the urban stormwater outfalls. It's not the stormwater catch basins, but where the water came up from each neighborhood. So we did this on a weekly basis for a couple of years. And we looked for a lot of measurements, not only pesticides, also pathogens and some other things. But my job, of course, was to analyze pyrethroids and other chemicals in the runoff water. So we did this for a couple of years. You can see we had a lot of data. To summarize, almost in all the samples, we saw pyrethroids. The levels are different places have different levels. Typically in Southern California, we have much higher levels. For pyrethroids, for example, we're talking about maybe a few hundred nanograms per liter. That's PPT. For fipronil as well, these levels are high enough to cause toxicity, aquatic toxicity, using the sensitive species. I'm sure this probably also have some implications for mosquitoes as well. So these are for the pyrethroids. For fipronil also, if you care to look for them, you'll find them. So this was what we call PN51, the project, and the great collaboration. We got a lot of data from the project firsthand. Here I just want to show you that some other people also did work in the early days, like Don Weston from Berkeley. He looked at pyrethroids in sediment, and this is from a Sacramento area. And as you can see here, the box on the top, that's a mortality for one of the invertebrates that he used. You can see in many cases, the mortality was close to 100%. And this also was done by some other groups. Here's Chris Holmes. And also, it's hard to say, in the middle of LA County, you can see for most of the samples, the survival was close to 0. So in other words, you do have these pyrethroids in sediments, and the levels are high enough to cause aquatic toxicity. The work is still ongoing, not for researchers. Researchers like us, we finished doing this a few years ago, but this work now is becoming a routine monitoring practice, for example, by California Department of Pesticide Regulation. So this chart is from Robert Budd. As you can see here, look at this is 2019 data. The chemicals found in waterways, you can see in many cases, bifenthrin was detected in more than 70% of the water samples, and they were over the threshold in 70% of the samples or cases. Also for cyflothrin, permethrin as well. Here's a chart again from Robert Budd. You can see again, this is mortality or survival. For storm drain water samples, the survival was only like 3%. In the receiving water, that means surface streams, was a little bit better. So there's obviously constant, wide distributed aquatic toxicity. There's another scenario, as I just mentioned at the beginning, that these pesticides are also used indoors. We don't normally do not think about it. We just spray along the wall. We don't normally think about, but over time you can imagine that these pesticides can go into your toilet, for example, in your sink. Then eventually they can make their way to the wastewater treatment plants. After the treatment, some cases the water is discharged into rivers or into natural systems. But in many cases, especially in Southern California, the water is discharged into the ocean. And here I want to show you that for the LA County, you can see that the water, treated wastewater, is being discharged into the Pacific Ocean. And we're talking about a lot of water, treated wastewater. This has been going on for many, many years, maybe for a century, you may say. So here you can look at that, in LA County, we have 1,400 miles worth of sewage pipe underground. So you can imagine that this is happening on a grand scale. So what we did is, this water, of course, is going to the Pacific Ocean. Then over years, of course, created a very contaminated, highly polluted area on the ocean floor. This is a Palos Verde shelf. Now it's becoming a Superfund site. And what we did is, a couple of years ago, we got some pressure samples from LA Sanitation District. And we looked for pyrethroids and also for fipronil. Here, I just want to show you that from these ocean marine sediment samples, we did also find a lot of pyrethroids. Especially close to where the treated wastewater is being discharged. That's the wastewater outfall. That's like 1 mile off the coast. And we also did a lot of statistical analysis. We found for some of the chemicals, the wastewater treatment is the source, is the primary source. Those are on the left. But in some other cases, also we have surface runoff, because along the coast you have rain events. You can carry whatever that's on the surface into the ocean. So we have two sources for ocean pollution. But this is not very relevant to what we are talking about in terms of vector control. I just want to show you that the range or the magnitude of impact of this urban pesticide use. Okay, also, of course, my group, along with many other groups, we have also been doing work, try to come up with mitigation practices. In our case, for example, we have worked on vegetative filters, how we can, basically, how we can trap these particles. And we also have done work using wetlands. And I just want to have a couple of slides to show you that one of my current PhD students is working on. This is the Prado Wetlands. It's a huge, few hundred acre, well-maintained wetlands. And our PhD student, Zach, has been working on this for the last 2 or 3 years. So what we are looking for here is to see if the wetlands can really reduce pesticides in the water. So he picked up a few different spots to look before and after of measuring pesticides at the inlet as well as at the outlet, and to see if there's a decrease. So he has been doing this on almost on a monthly basis for a couple of years. So this is how the wetlands look like. In the warm seasons, it's basically filled with a lot of grass, a lot of other vegetation. So they're very effective at trapping sediments, at trapping nutrients, as well as chemicals. Very quickly here, you see the levels of water at inlet. Blue is the inlet, orange is the middle, outlet is the outlet of a wetland treatment cell. Normally it's more than 10 acres in terms of size. You can see these wetland cells are very good at filtering out the pesticides, so less of pesticides are going out in the water. But this also means that the wetlands are very good at trapping these chemicals, so they're keeping these chemicals in their sediment. As you can see here, we're seeing a lot of chemicals, of these chemicals in the sediment of these wetlands. So this has a different implication, even though we're helping, but really we're trapping these chemicals in the sediment. And as I mentioned before, these chemicals, they can really stay very strongly bound to the sediment. And there you can have, almost think that the sediment is acting as a source. You can slowly release these chemicals back into the water. I put this slide here. Just want to show that over the years we have worked very closely with regulators, and our work, also work from our colleagues, have really been translated into regulation changes or improvements. So CDPR has issued new regulations on the use of pyrethroids. Here you can read the details. And also they have done similar things to fipronil. So that's, again, just want to show that what we do as a researcher can also have very good, very important implications, especially in the state of California. So before I finish up, I want to say that, what I have presented here is very different, I guess, from the mosquito control, the vector control community. But we're very lucky to become part of this project. And I think there are, good opportunities for us also to contribute. So from what I have said so far, the urban use of pesticides, especially pyrethroids, I think we're looking at a scenario, really, we have low levels of these chemicals everywhere in the environment, in California. We have low levels of these pyrethroids in the storm catch basins. Probably any standing water we can see in the urban areas, in surface streams, of course also in urban wetlands. And so this may have very important implications because these places are also maybe very important mosquito habitats in urban areas. So this is not only that we have these residues everywhere, probably almost year-round, we should say. So these mosquitoes or mosquito larvae, probably they're being exposed to these very low levels of pyrethroids at low level continuously. This may have implications, for example, in terms of the evolution of insecticide resistance, which is hugely important because for vector control, we'll only have a few chemicals to use. If due to insecticide resistance, if we had to lose any one of these chemicals, it's going to be a very important impact. So over the summer, my student Mason is supported by this grant. He has been working with Sarah and also Stephen, as well as Marsha and some other people. What we did is we went around to different places in West Valley, as well as up in Sacramento, and also Woodland, to collect basically sediment samples as well as water samples from those 30 stormwater catch basins. And on the right now, you can see that this is how the stormwater catch basins really look like. I guess, you know, they look very dirty, but they're very useful because they really trap. You can see some of the debris. This, of course, is during dry season. So during storm season could be totally different. So Nathan collected both sediment samples and water samples. We got some data. So Nathan's still working on these samples. Hopefully we'll get some more data. We took samples from for 3 months from all these places. You can see that the levels of these chemicals, it's a little hard to see here, but in the catch basin sediment, compared to sediments where we elsewhere, they're very, very high. So my guess is, you know, these are the sediment you have in the catchment basin. They're basically very rich in organic matter, and they can really bind these pyrethroids very tightly. So over time, these pyrethroids can accumulate, and also you have a very cool and somewhat reduced environment. We don't really know, but my guess is pyrethroids, once they are in these catch basins, they can stay there for a very long time. When mosquitoes get into these catch basins, they can probably constantly exposed to these pyrethroids at low levels for many, many months out of the year. And this may have important implications in terms of insecticide resistance evolution. Okay, to recap, urban insecticides, typically we don't think this way, but they're used very extensively, especially in California. They're used both in and outside of the homes. Especially residues outside the home, they can move in surface runoff, especially in the form of particles. Then the runoff, they can just enter storm drains in most cases. They can contaminate numerous small and large water bodies, you may say, in different shapes and forms, year-round, pretty much in California. And I want to emphasize, because of the strong affinity of pyrethroids to organic matter, to sediment. So the sediment we see in the natural environment or in the stormwater catch basins, I'm sure they serve as a very important, effective reservoir of pyrethroids. They can constantly supply trace levels of pyrethroid into the water. Maybe that's where the mosquito larvae can get exposed to. Mosquito, of course, use some of the same places because of the water as their habitats. So I think this coexistence, I think probably has very important implications. Of course, we're just environmental chemists. My gut feeling is very likely they may have important influences on the mosquito distribution, the ecology. Also, of course, they can also contribute to insecticide resistance in evolution among the different strains. That's the question we try to answer. But of course, we don't have that kind of expertise. Hopefully, by working with people participating in this seminar, we can get a better understanding of this potentially very important topic. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jay. Questions? I've got a question for you, and maybe we can take it up next week. But Xiaoming Wang at UC Irvine is rearing mosquitoes in water from some of these stormwater catch basins, and finding that these invasive Aedes don't do well in that water. So do you think the levels of pesticides in that water is are they high enough to cause mortality, or it's just a low level? I think it's a low level selection.
Well, we can look for these chemicals. I think pyrethroids, if they're very effective to other insects, I'm sure they're also very effective to mosquitoes. I think it's very likely they're causing some mortality to the mosquitoes in this case.
We'll have a discussion with her next week to see what she's finding. She can give you more of the details than I can, but very interesting.
Yeah, the levels are low, but I don't think they're that low.
Yeah.
Especially for mosquitoes. Probably does not take much to kill a mosquito, I would say. Which is a good thing, right?
But in many of the basins we sample the water samples contain mosquito larvae. So there are some stragglers.
Yeah. In Prado, are you finding that there's a gradient across that wetland so that the pesticide levels are high coming off the San Ana River? By the time you reach the west end of that wetland, there's a significant decrease in the load?
Exactly here. But yeah, he's got a couple of years worth of data. There's in terms of water column, yes, there's a significant decrease. Sediment as well. You've been there, the wetlands, they're filled with grass, and it's very effective in terms of retaining these chemicals, trapping these chemicals.
Are the plants taking it up? So I know the plants take up the heavy metals, but are they taking it up? Most of those organic or synthetic pyrethroids are staying in the surface.
Good question. Yeah, actually, Zach gave a talk to our group not a long time ago. Depending on the chemicals, like fipronil, yes. Pyrethroids mostly to the biofilm, on the stem, and still a little bit bioabsorption, you may say.
Yeah.
But probably not going into the plants, no.
Davis, do you have any questions, or anybody out there in the audience? In the ether.
Yeah, I was curious about larval exposures for sure, and the fact that you're finding lots of pyrethroids in the solids could present exposures to mosquitoes if they ingest any of those solids. So I wonder if there's any role of the solids in storing the pesticides such that they ingest it. So can that kind of exposure result in effects on the mosquitoes?
Well, Chris, that's a wonderful question. In fact, we have done quite a bit of work on so-called sediment bioavailability. So the question really is a bioavailability question. Yes, I would say, some of the chemicals on the sediment particles, they can easily come off when an insect digests the particles in the gut, for example.
How long does it persist in the soils? Because it looked like you see seasonality with the lowest in February, but I assume year over year it's not just continued accrual such that it increases in a given place?
Well, pyrethroids are certainly different from DDT, so you don't have this, long-term accumulation or increase. I would say the half-lives of bifenthrin, for example, in sediment, it's about probably like a year or less, but it's very long. It's not as long as DDT, but it's also very long.
And that's even in the absence of sunlight then?
That's right.
Okay, interesting.
Well, thanks for the support of PackBack. That's the most important.
Thanks for the work. Collaboration. Great.